Thank you, Scott. Today we want to share some of our thoughts about possible media futures with you. We're going to start by taking a quick trip through the early web and taking that trip from then to now to examine what might have been lost in the process of that evolution. Then we'll look at some current and emerging culture around both media interactions and network topologies. And we'll finally speculate on some of how those cultures might influence the media landscape of the near future. So let's begin. The early web was an odd place. In many ways, it was completely primitive by today's standards. You couldn't buy groceries or stream television shows or look at anything on your phone, and many of the features that are ubiquitous today were not even conceived of at the beginning. But as we look back now at this good distance, we can start to see that the early web had affordances and values that have shifted quite a bit in the intervening years. For one thing, the web originally had a certain lack of hierarchy or privilege, of flatness, of reach and presentation was there, and it extended publication capabilities to anyone who could write some code or hire space on a server. And for the first decade of the web or so, much of the innovation that we saw was focused on reducing those barriers, creating authoring and publishing tools that made it so that anyone with an idea could express it and publish it and spread it. First, blogging platforms came and they removed the need to learn to code or hire developers, making it ever easier to build a voice and a following on your website. And any one of those sites could link to any other, and following that link provided a consistent universal experience no matter what visitor saw that or no matter who that person was. After the advent of blogging tools, we then saw the emergence of social platforms, which for a while looked like they would continue the trend of increasing openness and access to authorship. Both individuals and established publishers flocked to these new platforms to be able to publish their ideas in a common space. But as they evolved, the business part of the online media business was also evolving. And these platforms, which acted as gateways to voices large and small, began to employ tactics for earning money. Those tactics involved an important shift in what it meant to publish online. Social platforms are closing windows and doors today in order to aggregate larger audiences and sell more ads, and they pull more external media onto their platforms so that they might become the hub of their users' online experiences. Today we find that publishers of all kinds, from individuals to large organizations like ours, are becoming more and more dependent on these external platforms to reach their readers who used to come directly to them and with whom they shared a direct relationship. As a result, the web that used to behave as a public space made by and for the people that inhabited it has instead become a series of privately owned spaces that give citizens platforms for expression, but only within their own walls and constrained to the ways that expression yields a revenue stream. Anil Dash recently said this best, I think. Privately owned public spaces aren't real public spaces. They don't allow for the play and the chaos and the creativity and brilliance that only arise in spaces that don't exist purely to generate profit. And we can see several examples of how this is already beginning to happen. Flipboard announced earlier this month that they would be expanding their aggregation product to the web from a native mobile platform. And in doing so, would start natively hosting publishers' content on Flipboard and sharing revenue rather than linking off to publishers' websites. As Matt alluded to, Facebook has also been eager to get content, particularly videos, published directly onto their platform. And they're also discussing how pages and articles might soon follow. Snapchat encourages publishers to create these bespoke vignettes that are self-contained and native to the experience of what it means to be within that app. And more broadly, we see many native mobile apps being developed in this fashion that unintentionally subverts linking behavior. They behave very differently from the open internet. And when we look at the web itself, we've seen moves to obscure the full display of URLs in the browser, further obscuring that openness that we've talked about before. This first occurred on mobile devices where physical space on the screen is a premium, but now it's becoming more common on desktop browsers as well. We're starting to see publishers respond to the dominance of platforms by relinquishing the platforms that they do own. There's a company called Now This News. They're a mobile news video producer. And they recently dismantled their website completely. And now they publish only into the platforms where their viewers already are. And we may soon see others follow suit.
So bloggers, news organizations, writers, and other creators of all shapes and sizes rely on bringing readers to their properties. And the prospect of giving up total control of that experience, as David Carr recently put it, sends a cold, dark chill down the collective spine of publishers. Business models that had been forged over decades and finally refined for new digital realities begin to break apart, no longer held together by the gravity of a large habitual audience. Furthermore, these social platforms in many ways are serving important editorial and distribution functions. The algorithms they author often determine which news you see and under what circumstances. So they're performing a role that has historically been held by journalistic institutions, but they probably don't see themselves or think of themselves as performing a function of the free press. The world we live in now is one in which millions of Facebook users don't believe they use the internet or think Facebook is the internet. And in many key ways, they're correct. Their experience of digital media is mediated in ways never dreamed of by longtime residents of the web. So this is our reality, and as it's evolving, not one internet with common rules and common understanding, but a holographic shattering of what the internet means. Each experience wholly insular and internally consistent, but separate and apart from every other. And in some ways, this is only an acceleration of what came before. What was a consistent daily publication rhythm for a company like The Times became a frenetic, up-to-the-minute process of pumping information into a dozen different endpoints. So now, in addition to those sites and apps and services that we own, we also feed information into a dozen different endpoints that we don't, so that our brand can be seen, so that we can inform people wherever they are in whichever internet they call home. And many of these don't contribute to our bottom line or our balance sheet, but they do reach people with vital information and insight and serve the broader civic mission that we at The Times hold sacrosanct. In other ways, though, this could point to some very strange and fragmented media futures. In a recent piece in The All, John Herman extrapolates from this current state that we're in. What was even the point of websites, certain people will find themselves wondering? Were they just weird, slow apps with nobody in them? Why? A bunch of publications will go out of business, and a bunch of others will survive the transition, and a few will become app content giants, with news teams filing to Facebook and their very own Vine stars, and thriving Snapchat channels, and a Viber bureau, and embedded yackers, and hundreds of people uploading videos in every direction, and brands, and brands, and brands, and brands, the end. So while this is compelling as a critique of the present, when we imagine these futures that extend a straight line from that present, just like now, only more so, we almost always get it wrong. Yes, the near future inevitably includes the dominant forces of today, or at least some remnants of them, but it's also built from the strange and new things that are happening at the edges, things that are either newly possible or newly desirable. So what are we missing here? When we imagine that the ascendant corporate powers will continue to consolidate and control our media, we imagine the same kinds of cycles that we've seen in the past with television or music or even retail ecosystems, where major players come in and become so huge and powerful that they dominate everyone's experiences. And I think what we're missing is that the internet is different. The internet is inherently a two-way medium, and individuals have far more power to create alternatives to mainstream experiences in ways that haven't been possible in the past. And what's more, those individuals are far more savvy than these extrapolative futures give them credit for. Rather than passive consumers of media and technology, when we look at the ways that people use the internet, we see that we're becoming increasingly sophisticated network citizens, both in the ways that we consume, reappropriate, and create media, and in the ways that we are learning to navigate network topologies with virtuosity and creativity. So we're seeing that even as large platforms are building more constraints and less openness, that users are finding ever more creative ways to route around those constraints and to reassert some of those values that we saw in the early internet. So let's look at some of those new forms of participation.
Right. Looking at the ways people engage with media, one thing that's eminently clear is that no matter how much media organizations try to hew to the old dynamic of publisher and audience, no matter how much social platforms try to prescribe or constrain the forms of social expression, the so-called audiences for media are in fact participatory creators. Social media isn't just one facet of the internet that is separate and self-contained, it's a fundamental force that permeates all online media. And furthermore, it's not just about sharing content in whole cloth, saying, here's a link to something as it is, pristine and untouched, and here separately is my commentary on that. But instead, it's an insistence on appropriating and remixing content that is produced by traditional channels as a means of expression, critique, and connection. And that behavior is becoming increasingly sophisticated in the methods of navigating the flow of consumption, creation, and sharing. 20 years of the web is enough time to truly internalize and in some cases, in fact, grow up with the idea of media as a participatory culture rather than the broadcast and consume model. Collage, remix, and appropriation are our tools of first resort. And these creations are not the products of self-conscious artistic acts, but are simply how we engage with television, film, art, music, and more. And the ways that those approaches are applied are increasingly nuanced. Even media like video games, which are designed to be highly participatory in their own right, have seen the growth of venues like Twitch, which allows players to reuse that media as performative and social, allowing the gameplay to be broadcast, shared, and discussed. And every new tool or platform that emerges presents design constraints that push participants to make meaning within very small creative spaces. Vine's 6-second limit and the affordances of an interface have inspired all kinds of creative filmmaking. And Twitter's 140 characters have given birth to a wide variety of short-form commentary and expression. So when news and media publishers think about the audience, we need to understand that what we're talking about are people who want to not just read or watch or even comment and share, but who instinctively use the media we produce to actively engage, to create, to reuse, to build community, and to shape culture. LaToya Peterson recently had this on a Nieman Lab post, and I think it was perfect. We have to stop thinking about how to leverage whatever hot social platform is making headlines, and instead spend time understanding how communication is changing. What does news sound like in a remix-focused culture? As a news provider and a media organization, we're still very protective of the content we produce and have historically been wary, and sometimes for good reason, of letting anyone touch or change what we make. It took the New York Times a while to allow comments on its site at all, and even now, it only does so for certain articles. We've recently been getting better about inviting and participating in conversations between our writers and our readers, but those conversations tend to happen on other platforms rather than our own. Once we put something online, we still think of it as published in that old model, something that's complete and static. But what if we began to truly embrace the ways in which people want to use and deeply engage with the media as a means of expression and commentary? What if the Times became a platform rich with tools for dynamically playing and engaging with what we've published? We've already built a few tools in our R&D lab over the past couple of years that start to explore this. Quips was a project that Agnes Chang put together about 2 years ago. It was designed to allow for inline commentary that could be shared with as few or as many people as you like to keep your comments in as close a conversation as you would want. We also created, Alexis and I and several others in the lab created Compendium, which allowed our readers to take stories, photos, and even quotes, and to tell their own stories and timelines with those. But what if we took those ideas further? What if we built something where readers could highlight and ask questions about particular parts of an article in line, and reporters and editors would respond, turning the article into a living conversation? Jane Friedhoff, one of our creative technologists, is working on prototypes for this. Or what if our videos contained tools directly within them to select particular clips and export your own Vine or GIF to share? Deep Kapadia, one of our engineers, started working on a similar tool late last year. And what if we gave our readers the tools to build bots based on New York Times activity? Bots based on content are already being made, both internally and externally. NYT, a non-bot on Twitter, tweets every time we use an anonymous source. And Jake Harris, one of the Times newsroom developers, last year created Times Haiku, which finds passages from our stories that follow haiku patterns. So what if we made more of these tools where users could create bots that would tweet or act based on Times activity? We have the capacity to invite our audience in with open arms and allow them to engage more deeply with the information that we publish, and to turn our publication into a vibrant news space that behaves in ways that are native to the web culture that we live in.
So in addition to these kinds of emergent media cultures, we're also seeing new behavior that speaks to changes that are maybe slightly further out, rumblings at the edges that speak to how people exist in Hertzian space, how we navigate the physical network with more virtuosity and understanding, and how network infrastructure and design can affect community, privacy, and expression. A few of us in the lab, Noah Fian and Jane Friedhoff in particular, have been looking specifically at two kinds of emergent behaviors here, which can happen individually or in concert with one another. One has to do with local networks or subnets that are separate from the internet at large, either by being completely offline or by filtering and constraining the ways that they connect to the larger internet. And the other behavior has to do with the flow of information. So currently, the internet operates on a somewhat centralized hub and spoke model, but we're seeing a lot more experiments around decentralized distributed systems through mesh networking and peer-to-peer services. Political protest has been ripe for these kinds of experiments. For example, at Occupy, the Occupy Here network was a subnet available only to those who were present in Zuccotti Park and allowed protesters to communicate and share information that was not available to the internet at large. And in Hong Kong last year, we saw protesters using the FireChat app, which allows users to chat through ad hoc mesh networks that operate device to device, independent of the mainstream internet, in order to circumvent government censorship. And we see journalists using these tools too, using network technologies outside of the mainstream internet to further the free and secure exchange of ideas and information. The New Yorker's Strongbox and the Guardian's Secure Drop are services built on top of the Tor network that enable sources to more securely share files in order to avoid surveillance, censorship, or reprisal. And the Dispatch app, which was created by a team of journalists and computer scientists at Columbia and Stanford universities, is also intended to support secure communications for reporters, especially when they're in areas where communications are insecure or internet connectivity is unavailable. One of the functions that Dispatch has is a sneaker net, where Dispatch users can physically carry messages in order to aid in forwarding content when publishing to the open internet is unavailable or unadvisable. So messages are routed from device to device by explicit handoff until eventually a gateway device can access and publish. So while these are some of the specific solutions that we see being created with this kind of networking technology, we also see work being done in building hardware and software tools that make these kinds of approaches much more accessible and available. Things like Commotion Wireless, which offers open source communication tools for creating decentralized mesh networks, or Apple including peer-to-peer offline mesh networking in the iPhone since iOS 7, which has allowed for apps like FireChat to be developed. And then we also see companies like BitTorrent thinking about using their peer-to-peer technologies to create platforms for publishing content on the internet. Project Maelstrom is a new web browser they're creating that explores a way to make the whole web distributed in order to make it more resilient, secure, neutral, and open. As a result of these and other tools, I think we're going to see a lot more of this kind of experimentation and exploration that builds upon these features. So what does this make possible? In many cases, these technologies have been in existence for a while, but the confluence of increasing privacy concerns, the growth of the Internet of Things, the availability of better tools, and an increasingly astute user base means that we're seeing new interest and growth in these areas. So we've started doing some research, thinking about what new behaviors or norms might evolve around networked citizenship. In the R&D lab, we've begun researching local networks, exploring how we might design more constrained communities online. What are the affordances of such a network, and how might the constraints on access create opportunities for us for new kinds of interactions? You can think of this idea as a Hertzian tribe, a community that is defined by its shared network space. Like traditional communities and nations, these Hertzian tribes may have customs and behaviors that only exist within their borders. For example, within a community of trusted people, I might want to leak or make visible more of my personal data in order to create a sense of intimacy with those that I know and trust. For example, NOAA's designed a browser extension called Curriculum that we use in the lab, which is intended to make visible the research that we're doing, a visible stream of the ideas that we're all working on. So Curriculum's a browser extension that performs text extraction and analysis on all the web browsing activity in the lab and creates these streams of keywords and topics that we can view. So we've been trying to think about how you take this kind of activity that can and is being applied in really creepy and invasive ways and instead make it something that works for those who are using it. So first, context is crucial here. Curriculum is only available to the 7 of us in the lab. You have to opt in and be contributing to it in order to view it. And second, it respects the privacy of individuals by treating the whole group as a single semantic signal. So we're not tracking URLs by person, and we're actually not publishing the URLs. We're interested in this stream of topics that's created by the group as a unit. And third, it only looks at non-secure and non-private browsing. So no email, no bank accounts, or anything else that I selectively choose to keep private. By opting into this service, though, we create this intimacy, this sixth sense for ourselves about the research and the work that we're all doing, and it affords greater sharing with those we trust while respecting the privacy of all of us. In addition to creating these kinds of customs that are only visible when you're a member of a network community, The borders of that Hertzian tribe can also filter how that community presents itself to the external internet at large, filtering or fuzzing personal data to make it harder to surveil, track, or advertise to individuals without their consent. Perhaps users randomly swap cookies with one another or appear to have no tracked data, or that personal data is generated by a software agent rather than real behavior. All of these are experiments in taking this generally maligned idea of the walled garden and flipping that model around so that it is owned and controlled by users and adapted for their benefit and protection. How can we use these kinds of techniques to empower individuals and communities and to support freedom and agency in the exchange of media and information?
So what are the larger implications beyond the lab, especially for media? This kind of sophistication and virtuosity around how we use network infrastructure doesn't have as direct an impact for a media company on the things like what articles we publish or the platforms we engage with, but it does speak to a much more complex media landscape of the near future that we at the Times will need to understand and navigate. Some quick speculative examples on how this could play out in the realm of media and journalism. Local networks can give journalists greater freedom and protection to collaborate than centralized networks do. Reporters and researchers can use a router with local collaboration software installed to create an air-gapped network where sensitive documents and notes could be shared. Those source materials would not only be more secure in that they're not visible to public networks, but they could also be deleted or even physically destroyed, eliminating the possibility of leaks of sensitive information either by subpoenas or intrusion. On a one-to-one level, peer-to-peer networking and content distribution could start to break down media control and censorship in oppressive regimes. Right now, because of the centralization of the internet backbone, places like North Korea and China and Cuba can effectively be cut off from the internet and from any non-state-approved media. However, if you imagine peer-to-peer web browsers like Maelstrom evolving, gaining popularity, and moving to mobile devices, then anyone who visits these countries from the outside could conceivably be seeding the local internet with content caches of their devices, thereby circumventing government chokeholds on media access. New network behaviors will also challenge existing business media models. If users begin in earnest to use local subnets and other techniques in order to protect privacy, masking personal data through encryption, cookie swapping, or spoofing or other techniques, then the current proposition of targeting recommendations or advertisements against users' online behavior could begin to break down. In short, though, these technologies will soon be used for applications that we can barely imagine. And as people discover new and ever more complex ways to navigate their networked realities, those behaviors are ones that we as a news organization can use either in the service, well, we will use them, frankly, in the service of reporting, but they're also ones that we need to understand in order to most effectively publish and distribute our journalism throughout these new topologies.
So when we look at these broad ways that the internet is evolving, both how corporations and individuals are changing media and network culture, we see two dominant forces. On the one hand, we have commercial forces that are acting in response to economic pressures by creating walled gardens to amass their audiences and by constraining and fragmenting the openness that was at the heart of early web culture. But on the other hand, we're seeing that those ideas about openness and free communication are reasserting themselves in new ways, working both in and around mainstream platforms and networks. These communities speak to creative expression, citizen empowerment, and civic responsibility. They're largely non-commercial and in service of the public. Publishers like the New York Times sit at a strange junction of these two vectors. On the one hand, we are a for-profit company that needs to be commercially viable to survive. So we need to engage with the Facebooks and the Twitters and Tumblrs and Snapchats, and more generally with the economic realities of the online media business that demand massive scale and reach. But on the other hand, we have an explicit civic responsibility that is a critical part of our mission. And so we also need to make sure that we're engaged in the dissemination of information in a way that enhances society and performs a critical check on political and corporate power. So the future of media is complicated and one that looks nothing like what came before. Publishers like us will still own some of our own means of production, but we're also learning to navigate new relationships with platforms that we don't control but increasingly rely on. Yet we must also actively participate in emerging culture that wields the web not just as a platform, but as a new material. This material has layers made up of information, people, policy, and infrastructure, and we must learn all of its textures in order to use it adeptly as an expressive and complex medium for communication. I would love to be able to point to a coming device or technology and say, that thing is the thing that'll save everything and simplify all of this, let's all get on. But we all know that isn't how the future works. Instead, companies like the Times will be challenged to constantly reinvent ourselves, adapt our reporting and messaging in order to continue to reach new people in whichever internet they experience. Along the way, we will endeavor to keep the walls between those internets low. We will continue advocating for porous borders and open standards, and we will learn how to listen as well as we speak, also that the conversations can continue. Thank you very much.